Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In his lecture, What is Metaphysics?, there is one mood or affective state that Martin Heidegger is going to make particularly central. And he's doing this precisely because, as he says, the other moods, which can place us within beings as a whole, the totality of being, they miss something that anxiety is able to, in some way, encounter. And that is what Heidegger is calling the nothing, das Nichts. Now, other moods, as he says, conceal this. The mood of anxiety does not. He wants from the very beginning to make sure there's no confusion about what we're talking about when we're using this term anxiety or angst. And so we need to begin by looking at some of the distinctions that he's going to make. He tells us that, there we go, we don't mean the quite common anxiousness, ultimately reducible to fearfulness. So he's treating anxiety and fear as distinct modalities of some basic thing, which he says all too readily comes over us. Anxiety is basically different from fear. Why? We become afraid in the face of this particular being that threatens us in this or that particular respect. So we can say that we have, in a very broad sense, we might say, I'm feeling anxious about finances, or I'm feeling anxious about this date that I'm going to go on, or I'm feeling anxious about the interview that I have coming up, or I just feel anxious about what the future holds for me. And what Heidegger is saying is, well, in many of those cases, we might not be talking about anxiety as such. We're probably talking about fears that if we do enough analysis, we can pinpoint. What are you worried about is going to happen on the date? Oh, I think that I might spill my coffee and get it all over my pants and embarrass myself because then I'll look like a jackass. Or I might walk into the interview and forget all of the things that I put in my mind to think about this company and the responses that I want to give. We can go on and on. Those are distinct things that happen within being as a whole, but they pertain to a particular region of being or particular beings that we can pinpoint. Anxiety is something more global, he's going to say. Fear, he says, possesses this trait of being fear in the face of and fear for. We can also feel fear for something like I'm afraid for my child, I'm afraid for my car, I'm afraid for my finances, I'm afraid for my computer when I take it in to be repaired. He says, he who fears and is afraid is captive to the mood in which he finds himself, striving to rescue himself from this particular thing. He becomes unsure of everything else and completely loses his head. So there can be a global response to fear in terms of being as a whole, but it's not the same one as anxiety, which is going to reveal to us the nothing. He says, anxiety does not let such confusion arise. Much to the contrary, a peculiar calm pervades it. It is anxiety in the face of, and then he's got ... but it's not anxiety in the face of this particular thing. It is a more global feeling or emotion or attunement, however you want to discuss it, that pertains to beings as a whole. And he says, anxiety in the face of is always anxiety for, but not for this or that. It's got a certain, as Heidegger says, indeterminateness And so it's not a lack of determination. It's not as if you're being superficial or not analyzing things far enough and saying, well, what are you anxious about? If it's really anxiety, there is no one single thing that you can focus in on. There is going to be a back and forth that will center on the human person, but slipping away from the human person. So it's concerned with the world of being and where we are as acting persons within that world. So he says, in anxiety, and this is a very famous passage in Heidegger's work, one feels ill at ease, and the German for that is es ist einem unheimlich. A lot has been made out of this Unheimlichkeit that's involved in anxiety. We're not going to worry so much about that here, although that's an interesting subtopic. He asks, well, what is it that makes one feel ill at ease? We can't say when we feel genuine anxiety. As a whole, it is so for one. And now here he begins a kind of phenomenological description of what anxiety feels like. And he's being very metaphorical here. He is using terms of value, and he's using even more terms of spatiality and movement. These are not to be taken literally as if somehow beings are changing their location in relation to us. This has to be understood affectively and metaphorically. A very important point right here. So he goes on and he talks about one of the first traits of this. All things and we ourselves sink into indifference. So that's a value term right there, indifference. Notice what he's saying. All things, the totality of beings, and ourselves sink into indifference. It's not just that we remain exactly what we are and the totality of beings sink into indifference. We ourselves also sink into indifference. We are in the midst of the totality of beings. He goes on and he says, this is not in the sense of mere disappearance. Now he starts using spatial terms. In this very receding, things turn towards us. So there's a back and forth kind of metaphorical movement taking place here in anxiety. Things are slipping away from us. It's another way that he talks about it. He also says retreating, as if they are deliberately moving from us, or are fleeing us. But they also are turned towards us at the same time. So he says, this receding of beings as a whole that closes in on us. Now notice, it's closing in on us, oppresses us. We can get no hold on things. Each thing that we try to reach for, or if we grasp it, it loses its significance. It doesn't turn out to be what we had hoped it would be. So this is a key aspect of what Heidegger is calling anxiety. Again, I want to stress that these are metaphorical ways of talking about it. There really are no other ways of talking about it that can capture the experience of anxiety. Now he tells us, anxiety reveals the nothing. We hover, he says, in anxiety. Now that's what we're doing. We are feeling anxiety, but feeling anxiety also means that we have a sort of spatiality. We are hovering in it. It leaves us hanging, he says, because it induces the slipping away of beings as a whole. Here is where we get to the other side of the analysis. He says that we ourselves are slipping away from ourselves. So we find ourselves unable to count upon ourselves, unable to entirely recognize ourselves. Or what we do recognize, we realize is something different than what we thought we had there. You can understand this in many different ways. If you like talking about the ego, you could say that portions of the ego reveal themselves to be fabricated or not to be genuinely what one is. And he says, this implies that we ourselves, we humans who are in being, in the midst of being, slip away from ourselves. At bottom, it's not as though you or I feel at ease. Rather, it is this way for someone. It is this way for what Heidegger calls Dasein, existence, being there, human being. In the altogether unsettling experience, he says, pure Dasein is all that is left there. When you feel genuine anxiety, you are having a revelation, often a very uncomfortable revelation, isn't it, of what it is that you are when you strip away all of the other stuff that you think is you, that you are convinced is you. You are Dasein. I am Dasein. Heidegger is Dasein. And we are our own Dasein. But we share this, fundamental set of possibilities as well. And this can be quite difficult for people. So he talks here, and I'm not going to go into any detail about this, about how we try to evade anxiety by chattering and trying to do things to distract ourselves from it. He's got many analyses of this in Being and Time. We don't need to go into this. Coming back to what he's saying. With the fundamental mood of anxiety, we've arrived, he says, at the occurrence in human existence in which the nothing is revealed. How is it with the nothing? Now, I've got nothing on the board twice. I don't want you to think that these are two different nothings, as if we can somehow count up nothing. I just want to stress that the nothing is revealed within the totality of beings, but also in the human person, Dasein plus nothing. You can always add nothing to anything. In this sort of metaphysics. So he says the nothing reveals itself in anxiety, but it does not reveal itself as a being. It is not given as an object. And he stresses to us, anxiety is no kind of grasping of the nothing. You can't hold the nothing in your hand, but all the same, the nothing is there for Dasein. The nothing reveals itself in and through anxiety. That is our fundamental way of grasping the nothing. This is a key insight on the part of Martin Heidegger here. And he says that in anxiety, the nothing is encountered at one with beings as a whole. So he's going to stress to us that this does not take place by simply negating beings as a whole, something that we already looked at in terms of an insufficient definition of the nothing and the way in which the intellect does it. It's also not done by annihilating being as a whole, reducing everything to nothing, because we are in the face of beings. They do have being. They exist. And yet the nothing is also there. So here Heidegger is going to coin a term that a lot of people have actually taken umbrage with by talking about nihilating. He says that the nothing nihilates, literally makes nothing. It's not the same thing as annihilating, to reduce to nothing. The nothing nothings is how it has been put. And we're going to have to look at what that actually means. What is nihilating? But at this point, as far as this topic goes, what is going on is anxiety, this mood that we feel as human beings, is revealing to us not only the nothing along with the totality of beings, with this modality of receding and turning towards us, oppressing us, indifference, all these other great descriptors that we had, but also that the nothing is doing something, or it's literally doing nothing. It's nothinging, if we want to stretch language quite further. What that is has yet to be determined, but that is being revealed to us by anxiety.